There are hundreds of basic and alternate recipes in Satisfactory 1.0. Some of them are absolutely amazing, whilst others not so much. So I've made it my mission in Satisfactory to compare every single recipe in the game to inform you guys on what the best and worst recipes are. So welcome to the best recipes in Satisfactory 1.0 series. Today's video is all about the heavy modular frames. Heavy modular frames are a rather important mid-game item. This is because they are used to make everything from blenders, the nuclear power plant, radio towers, and even resource wells. These are all very vital in your playthrough, so it's good to start automating them as soon as you can. So let's take a quick look at these three recipes, and as you can see, they're rather complex. So just like what I did in this video where I told you guys about the best computer recipe, I've laid out all three of these recipes and I then condense it down into every single raw resource you will be consuming. So do not worry if this is confusing, let's break it down. But of course, if you guys do find this video helpful, I've got a lot more tutorials on the way, so make sure you guys are subscribed. Thank you very much. So let's start with the basic modular frame recipe, and for all three of these recipes we are making 5 heavy modular frames per minute. This is obviously done to make sure that our findings aren't biased towards one item, so everything is 5 heavy modular frames per minute. For the basic recipe, we are going to be needing 25 modular frames, 100 steel pipes, 25 encased industrial beam, and lastly, unfortunately, 600 screws per minute. And I suppose we'll start with this. The reason as to why I say unfortunately is because this is often quite a difficult resource to try and get. Crafting it might be easy enough, but it's actually trying to transport it around your world because you often have to deal with rather high quantities. The only belt in the game that can handle the 600 resources per minute is the Mark 6 belt, so you are going to have to split this into multiple different belts, unfortunately. But to make these screws, you need iron ingots. Some of you might realize, where are the iron rods? This is because I'm using a cast iron ingot alternate recipe, so I highly recommend it goes from iron ingots straight into screws, which cuts down on any constructors or iron rods needed to be made here in the middle, which of course saves you parts, time, electricity, power obviously, which is rather good. Now for this next step, I might have to give a trigger warning, since this seems to deeply offend some people. What I like to try and do is I like to try and use pure ingot recipes, which means I use less ore, a little bit of water to make more ingots. So rather than using 150 iron ore, I'm only using 81. This saves a lot of ingots. But some people don't like using this recipe, so if you would like to consume more resources, that's completely fine. If you were to use this recipe, of course, it means that you have to place down refineries and water extractors, which does consume more power. The obvious answer to that is, why don't you just make better power in your world? Well, some people don't want to. So again, feel free not to do this if you want, but if you'd like to save on resources, then feel free to do this. Moving on now to our 25 encased industrial beams, and unfortunately there's not really like an easy way to make this necessarily, but the best recipe I like to use, which does save you quite a lot of coal and steel and iron, is the steel pipe and concrete recipe, rather than the steel beam recipe, which costs you, of course, a lot more iron, water, coal, and a bit of limestone. The reason as to why I say a bit of limestone is because this recipe is something called the molded steel pipe alternate recipe, which is great, again, if you would like to save on coal and iron and water. So I do recommend using the molded steel pipe recipe if you are going to be using the alternate for the encased industrial beam. Again, I recommend it, otherwise I wouldn't be putting it into this graph. To make the pipes, you have to get some steel ingots, exactly 150 per minute, which then goes down to 100 iron ingots per minute, and then you combine that with the coal. The reason as to why I don't combine iron ore with, of course, the coal ore, is because you actually save iron by doing this strategy. You of course save iron ore by using water, you then save extra iron by making it into an ingot before adding it into the steel ingot recipe. Just another way to save resources, and unfortunately, yes, you do need some more concrete over here. You will be seeing throughout all three of these examples, by the way, that limestone is rather important, so just in case you feel like limestone is useless, it's not, especially not in these recipes. Now you might notice for our third item for the heavy modular frames also involves steel pipes, the exact same recipe that we used down here. So in total you are consuming 250 steel pipes. The reason why I've laid this out separately is to make it easier to visually see, But of course, you could just make the 250 steel pipes together, then just split it 100, then 150, if you so wish, which I do actually recommend if you do end up doing this recipe. Lastly, you need modular frames. There's multiple different recipes for modular frames, but this is just the basic one, and it's my favorite, which ends up consuming iron and water. That's it, just iron and water. Of course, you don't have to go with this recipe that I've showed down here. If you don't want to do this, if you want to get rid of the water, you'll be consuming 600 iron ore per minute, which then of course makes these 600 iron ingots. But if you do this, you only have to consume about half at 324 iron ore. This is the reason as to why I do this. I find it amazing. And essentially, the 600 iron ingot splits 3 different ways to make iron plates, screws, and iron rods. And of course, we're using our same screw tactic that I used at the very start of the video. So this looks rather complex, but a few of you might have realized we're only actually using 4 ingredients. And if you do the exact same setup that I've just showed you, this is what you end up with. You end up with less than 500 iron ore, just about, but that's not too bad. 627 water per minute, which might sound like quite a lot, but realistically that's only, what, 5 and a bit water extractors? It's not too bad. 412 limestone, which would be hundreds more if you didn't use water, and of coal it's only about 167, which again isn't too bad. If you weren't to use the water tactic that I've been showing throughout today's video so far, which I'll continue to use, you'll probably have to consume somewhere near 1000 iron ore in order to make everything I've just showed, and that's 1000 iron ore just for 5 modular frames. Is it really worth it? Or heavy modular frames, that is. So that is our first recipe. Now let's move on to one of our first alternates, the heavy encased frame. For this you are going to need modular frames the exact same like before, steel pipe the exact same like before, encased industrial beam the exact same like before, and lastly, concrete. Before we had screws, now we've got concrete, and I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this because let's just take a minute to compare this for a quick second. The heavy encased frame, we're using 13.4 modular frame. The basic, we're using 25, which is a lot more. The heavy encased frames, we're using 60 steel pipes. The basic, we're using 100, which is a lot more. The encased framed, we're using just 16.67 encased industrial beam. The basic, we're using a lot more. And again, just 37 concrete, compared to 600 screws per minute. Despite the fact it took me like half an hour to lay all this out, there's not really much point me actually yapping on about it, because we can very clearly see this recipe is just better. And if we were to look at the total ores consumed, which don't worry, at the end of the video, I do have a comparison with all 3, so make sure you stay tuned for that. But if we have a look at this, we can see we're only using 230 iron ore, 404.15 water per minute, limestone at just 370, and coal at 107. This is better. That's only 2 examples. We've still got one more, which is the heavy flexible frame. This thing requires modular frames the exact same amount as our first recipe, but instead it now requires rubber, which unfortunately does use crude oil. So if you don't want to use crude oil for whatever reason, you might want to avoid this one. Third of all, we have encased industrial beams. And lastly, we have 520 screws, which is less screws than our first recipe, but of course, our second recipe didn't involve them. We are using the exact same recipe list though as our first one, because I just find this really simple. Again, just 70 iron ore can make you 520 screws per minute. I think that's a very, very good trade-off. Now, when it comes to encased industrial beams, we're using 15 per minute, which is actually less than our second recipe, and of course it's a lot less than our basic. So luckily you're using a lot less resources, so you save out on iron, water, limestone, and coal, which of course is fantastic, right? Like I very briefly mentioned earlier, to make the 100 rubber, we have to then use this recipe right here, which involves plastic and fuel. You can convert crude oil straight into rubber, but it's going to cost you an absolute fortune. So instead, if you were to split it like this, it makes things a lot easier. For that, you have to make 50 plastic per minute, which gives you 25 heavy oil residue per minute, which isn't really a lot. I've already made a video talking about diluted fuel in Satisfactory. I'm not sure if it's out yet, so I'll explain this very, very quickly. If you were to combine water and heavy oil residue, you can make fuel, and you save an absolute ton of crude oil, like ton, like literally so much crude oil per minute you save if you were to do this instead. Yes, it involves water. So, if you don't like using water, and if you think placing down one water extractor is going to force you to have like a mental breakdown, don't do this. And if you want to make things worse for yourself, just convert the crude oil straight into the rubber. It might make things a bit easier, but you will regret it later on. So, if you turn that into heavy oil residue, 25 per minute, you then get 12.5 polymer resin as a byproduct for free. And like I keep saying, if you would like to not use the water recipe, that's completely fine. Just be prepared to consume double the amount of ores than what you really have to be. But if it saves space, then hopefully that's what you want. Overall, this doesn't look too bad. Iron ore seems relatively high at 426 per minute. Water is at 455 per minute, which is slightly higher. Limestone is at almost 200 per minute, whereas coal, I believe, is the lowest we've seen so far today, at 60 per minute. Unfortunately though, yes, you are using crude oil. But how does this compare to the other two recipes? Well, I think now it's time to see an overall comparison, which luckily I've already done. For the heavy modular frames, you're using 500, let's just say 500 iron ore. This compares to the 230 that you're using for the heavy encased frame, and the 426 that you're using for the heavy flexible frame. So you're actually saving resources if you were to use this middle one. For the water, you are saving the most resources again if you use the heavy encased frames. For the limestone, you actually get the least amount of limestone usage from the heavy flexible frame. So if limestone's a problem for you, then make sure you maybe check out this recipe just in case. Next, we've got coal, where again, you actually save coal if you use the heavy flexible frame. And lastly, just for this category I suppose, we've got crude oil. So you're using the least amount of limestone, the least amount of coal, but again you involve oil. Whereas this recipe, you use the least amount of iron by a landslide, may I add, and you're also using the least amount of water, whilst also using a pretty decent amount of limestone and a very decent amount of coal. So, if I was to recommend a recipe to go with, I think most of you have guessed it by now, it's the heavy encased frame. Simply put, the heavy modular frames in Satisfactory isn't necessarily easy to make, but if you're looking for the easiest way to make it and the best recipe in my opinion, what you're looking at is the best one, and this is most certainly what I'll be using in my 1.0 playthrough. This video took quite a long time to make, so I hope that you guys did enjoy it, and let me know down below what recipe will you be using for 1.0. Either way, thank you for watching. But before we go, a massive thank you to our members, Mau Mau, Skull and Hattie, Lo, Litormal, Chaos Rising, Cutthroat Zoo, Yummy Kel, and Tio Rico.